think about retirement for the next 5 to 10 years, you want to focus on growing your portfolio as much as possible.
Hi again. We're resuming our week's work. And in the first place, I wanted to ask, is there anything from last time you wish to discuss? You have questions or so on? Good. So let's resume. And we saw that last time the Viet Minh won this great victory. It took the French really by surprise. The French had this deeply entrenched and isolated position at Dien Bien Phu, strategically located, blocking the route to Laos and also inhibiting the movement of men and materials from China down into Indochina. And the answer of General Giap was basically people's war, mobilization of vast numbers, hundreds of thousands of peasants, porters, militia, and of course, regular troops, and through the forests, through the jungle, and over hills and dales. They moved huge amounts of equipment, including heavy cannon, into position around this isolated valley of Dien Bien Phu, and they were able, using the cannon they installed on the hills and mountaintops, to bombard the French position and also fend off air attacks. The French were unable to sort of damage, because they were so deeply dug in, the Viet Minh artillery. And this cut off French supplies, and they ultimately were using spades. They were able to approach the French forts, and after a 2-month siege between March and early May 1954, they overran the French positions. The French lost, they had 15,000 troops. About half of them were killed and wounded. The Viet Minh casualties were much larger. 25,000 Viet Minh were killed or wounded. But from a strategic point of view, although this loss, the French regarded the situation as essentially lost. In fact, even before Dien Bien Phu, back in France, people began to refer to the war as the dirty war, la guerre sale, meaning it was a nasty business. And moreover, it was Indochina was a losing proposition from an economic point of view. It was a drain on France. So with the defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the French were finished. And in fact, everybody reached a conclusion in France that it was over and France had to get out. Indeed, at the very time that this defeat occurs, the revolution in Algeria, which is of course just across the Mediterranean from France, has broken out, and this is quite serious. There are well over 1 million Frenchmen living in Algeria. Algeria is regarded as a department of the French state, and so the French basically decide to cut their losses and to get out. Now, the Viet Minh, of course, were jubilant, and General Giap, in his statement about his victory, and it was very much his victory. This is his a brief statement from him. He said, "A colonized people, once that has risen up and is united in the struggle and determined to fight for its independence and peace, has the full power to defeat the strong, aggressive army of an imperialist power." And basically what he's saying there is that this was a people's war. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was based on this huge amount of popular support, partly related to the nationalism and partly related to the prospect of the distribution of land. And this People's War, of course, well organized, and we saw that the Communist Party plays a big role. It's a semi-military or military organization. It basically enables a military mobilization of the population, and this essentially explains the outcome of the war. Of course, the Chinese made their contribution, and I would say that when relations deteriorated between China and Vietnam at the end of all of this, it was a temporary thing, but nevertheless very serious. They began to fight this battle once again, in the sense that the Chinese claimed, "Oh, without us, you wouldn't have been able to win," and the Vietnamese responded by saying, "No, this is Chinese chauvinism, etc." There was this, maybe there still is, some dispute about who won the victory at Dien Bien Phu. In any case, the Viet Minh victory came on the 8th of May, and the next day, the Geneva Conference opened in Switzerland, attended, of course, by France, by England, by the United States, by Russia and China, but also by the representatives of the Viet Minh and China. Well, China was a part of this. The Americans would not sit at the same table with the Chinese. They had to reconfigure the conference table because the Americans, they had just finished their war against China in Korea. They were so bitter at the Chinese, they did not recognize China, and so they said, "We won't sit at the same table." So they had to have a separate sort of arrangement where the Americans sat to the side rather than sitting with their enemy across the conference table. Meanwhile, the French, having been defeated, basically they ordered all their troops in North Vietnam to assemble at Hanoi. They evacuated most of Tonkin, preparatory, most of them came to Hanoi, and then they gradually moved to Haiphong, the port, and were evacuated from North Vietnam. The whole of North Vietnam, including Tonkin and Annam, was now completely under the control of the Viet Minh, and about half of the Cochin also was now occupied by the Viet Minh. So we would say that from a military point of view, most of Vietnam had fallen into the hands of the Viet Minh. But we'd say that one thing we should note is that the Americans were deeply involved in all of this. They followed this all closely. There were important meetings of the Eisenhower administration, the president, the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, Secretary of State, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they watched the French go down. And if you could believe it, at one point, the chief of staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said to Eisenhower, what we should do is basically use tactical nuclear weapons to help the French. That is to say, they should explode atomic weapons on the mountaintops in order to get at the Viet Minh artillery. And there were further discussions. Well, the Americans consulted the British, and the British said, we want nothing to do with this. We will have no part in any further involvement in this conflict. And it was the British veto, plus the fact that the Americans had just finished their war in Korea, which basically played the main part in deciding, in Washington's deciding not to intervene on the side of the in a massive way on the side of the French. Well, the conference, I say, the Geneva Conference opens on the 9th of May, 1954. The French, of course, wanted to get out, and indeed the fall of Dien Bien Phu had precipitated a fall of the French government. There was a new prime minister. His name was Pierre Mendès France, and he was a clever sort of centrist politician, and he wanted to cut the best deal possible. And now I'm discussing the proceedings, the Geneva Conference, and so on. This is what we're getting into, and how the Americans sort of, in many ways, in a successful way, sort of shaped the outcome, although they deepened their involvement, as you'll see in a minute. Well, the French attitude was, we want to get out. And when Mendès France was negotiating, he said to the Viet Minh and to the Russians and the Chinese, look, if you don't come to some sort of a deal, you're going to have the Americans on your neck. The Americans, he threatened then that the Americans, this was not true, but he threatened that the Americans would come in massively. And so that was a consideration. And the other consideration, which was important, was France was in a way in a strategic position, because what was happening in Europe was NATO, the Americans wanted, in order to beef up NATO, to allow West Germany, their ally, to rearm. They wanted to include West Germany in NATO. And the Russians were terrified that the Germans would rearm. This is 10 years after the war. Russia has lost 26 million people to the Germans. They were very afraid of this. And so the French said, well, our decision as to whether we were going to allow Germany to rearm would be based partly on the outcome of this meeting. So with respect to both China and Russia, they didn't want the Americans to come in full force into Vietnam. And the Russians in particular were fearful of German rearmament. So they put pressure on the Viet Minh to be reasonable. At this point, the Viet Minh could simply have taken over the whole of Vietnam. But the Russians and the Chinese counseled moderation. And later on, there was a lot of bitterness. Again, I've mentioned this bitterness over Dien Bien Phu between the Chinese and the Viet Minh. Well, a second cause of upset on the part of the Viet Minh was, hey, you twisted our arms. We could have taken the whole of Vietnam right then and there. It forced us into a compromise. And we're going to be talking about the nature of this compromise in a few minutes. So in any case, the DRV was essentially forced to accept a deal. And this deal became basically the so-called Geneva Accords. And this is what I'm outlining at this point. The Geneva Conference, it concludes with a set of accords which were supposed to bring peace to Vietnam. And they do play a part in the later outbreak of the conflict with between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the United States. So it's important to sort of go into the terms of this of these Geneva Accords. And if you would look at Mitchell, I believe it's document 8 of Mitchell. There you find the Geneva Accords. So I'm going to outline them, but also we will have a little discussion at the beginning of next class about the text of the Geneva Accords. So essentially, there were 4 provisions of the Geneva Accord. First of all, the first thing was that the two sides had to be separated according to these accords. That is to say, it was said that all of the French forces and their allies, the Vietnamese who were fighting alongside the French, the mercenaries, should basically, and anybody else who wanted to accompany these forces, they should move south. The dividing line was in the center of Annam, in the center of Vietnam, at the 17th parallel. At the 17th parallel, 17th degree latitude would be the separation point. And the Viet Minh should move north of that. They should move toward Hanoi and Haiphong. The two belligerents should separate. And this separation at the 17th parallel was to be temporary, because 2 years after the Accords, it was provided that there would be elections in both North and South Vietnam, and the party that received the largest amount of votes would basically organize a new government for both the North and the South of Vietnam. So the first place is the separation, temporary, at the 17th parallel. And the second provision is that 2 years later, there's going to be this national election. And the third part is that Cambodia and Laos are now independent states. They're sovereign states. The French are no longer to be there, and they become independent states. The last provision is setting up a body which can supervise the implementation of these 3 points: the independence of Cambodia and Laos, separation at the 17th parallel, and 2 years later, a national election. Are there any questions about this? Okay. Now, this body was called the International Control Commission, the ICC for short, the International Control Commission. There were 3 states who were to participate in this International Control Commission. There was, in the first place, a neutral state, India, which considered itself neutral as between the East and the West, the communist world and the capitalist world, India. The second state was Poland. Poland, clearly after 1945, is a communist state. So there is this communism. Does anybody know the name of the third state that was assigned to the International Control Commission? What was the name of the state? The state of Canada was the third state. Now, this was a stroke of good luck on the part of Canada. Ultimately, there were some 250 Canadian officials who basically went to Vietnam and supervised this International Control Commission. Well, this was a stroke of luck, I said. Why was that? Because when the actual American war broke out, the Americans basically looked around, they said, well, our allies should help us. And so they began to twist the arms of various countries that they could to send troops. So, for example, the Australians, the South Koreans, the troops from Taiwan, these I said the Philippines, had to send troops. And it's almost certain they would have turned to Canada and insisted that Canada sent troops. Canada had participated in the Korean War. It had sent troops in the Korean War, but in this war, Canada escaped because it was on the ICC. And of course, subsequently, Canada had to participate in the invasion of Iraq. They refused to participate in the invasion of Iraq, but they sent troops to Afghanistan, as you know. So what I'm basically saying is that Canada, most of the time, has to do what the Americans want them to do. And in this case, they were lucky because they didn't have to send Canadian forces to Vietnam. Well, nevertheless, it was very clear from the beginning that, yes, India may have been neutral, but Poland was not neutral, and neither was Canada. Poland acted in behalf of the communist world, and Canada, and it was very explicit, basically served the interests of the United States on this International Control Commission. Those were the essential terms of the agreement. And then at the end, the various parties attending the conference, the Chinese, the Russians, the British, the French, the Viet Minh, they all signed the Geneva Agreement. The United States did not sign the agreement. They were sitting on the side and they said, no, we will not sign on to this agreement, but, and this is the declaration that the Americans said, they declared that it would not sign, but it would refrain from the threat or use of force to disturb these provisions. In other words, they recognized the Geneva Accords. They said that they would not disturb them, but they would not sign them either. in some ways, from a legal point of view, the more important outcome was that there was a government already in South Vietnam. That was the government set up by the Élysée Accords. Remember Bao Dai, the emperor, the French, sort of, it was a kind of like a puppet state, the Bao Dai government, 1949. Well, they were still there, and Bao Dai's delegates were present, and they refused to sign the Geneva Accords, as well as the Americans. And this became important because subsequently the South Vietnamese government refused to allow elections to take place. They refused, with the agreement of the United States, that no election would be allowed. And why was that? Because everybody knew if there was an election, and this is confirmed by Eisenhower himself, that if an election occurred in private, we know, we have his letters. He said 80% of the population would vote for the Viet Minh or for the DRV. So the Americans agreed, and Bao Dai refused to sign the accords, and this became the justification for not holding these elections following the Geneva Accords. This is an important point. Does anybody not get this or want some sort of explanation? Because it's a kind of escape hatch that was used by the Americans when they decided, as you'll see, to basically not allow an election to occur. Now we come to the point. Following the outcome of the Geneva Conference, the Americans made the decision, and let's go back, and even before the fall of Dien Bien Phu, the Americans were considering direct intervention with atomic bombs. So the Americans, they wanted, they were desperate not to have South Vietnam fall as a domino to the communists. And following the conference, they basically decide, this is Eisenhower and Dulles, let's try and use the Bao Dai government. What we'll do is we'll bolster the Bao Dai government, and we'll strengthen this government. Basically, we're not going to allow any kind of election, because that would be a bad outcome. And we'll set out a South Vietnamese government under Bao Dai. And so this is precisely what they proceeded to do. They figured, their reasoning included the idea, well, if the French are leaving, Bao Dai remains, this government and its administration, and even they have some armed forces. Well, it won't, the French will no longer be present. And so maybe we can build up this government as an alternative to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And this is precisely what they set out to do. And the basic reason, of course, is you know already, the containment of communism overall was basically this was the overall global vision. And so this is what they committed. And of course, it made a certain amount of sense, because you will remember that this is precisely what they had done in 1945 in Korea. This happened in Korea, the separation of North and South Vietnam in 1945 at the 38th parallel. Here we're talking about the 17th parallel. The 38th parallel was the line of separation between North and South Korea, and still is to this day. But of course, a war had to be fought between 1950 and 53. To confirm that, the Americans intervened to prevent reunification. And it was successful in a certain way because South Korea became a bastion of containment as a result. I would note that one has to see this within the overall context of the Cold War. I would say up to this point, the Americans were winning the Cold War. They were, in their terms, containing communism. There had been a civil war in Greece between the communists and the non-communists right after the war broke out. The American intervention had helped the non-communists to win that war. Only very recently in Iran, a communist-leaning government, this is what the Americans said, in Iran had been entrenched and tried to nationalize the oil resources of Iran. And the Americans and the British had overthrown that government. It was a victory for the CIA. The very year we're talking about, 1954, they overthrew a left-leaning government in Guatemala in 1954. And they were suppressing the communists in the Philippines. And alongside the British, they were defeating the communists in Malaysia. And they had succeeded in creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for Europe. It's a bulwark against the Soviet Union. So I would say that the Americans had been successful, or were up to this point, and they thought they could do the same thing in Vietnam. So this is the general context in which this idea of creating a separate South Vietnamese state comes in, divided at the 17th parallel. And from that point onwards, not allowing these elections to take place. So that's the first. So this is the outcome of the Geneva Conference. But the Americans went further than that. They went further than that. It wasn't only that they set up this new state, the 17th parallel. They also created a new Pacific Alliance to contain communism in Asia, and particularly Southeast Asia. The name of that alliance, does anybody know the name of that alliance? Right here, Sept, the Sept Alliance, which was, the Americans were preparing this all through the Geneva Conference. And they, at Manila in the Philippines, they created a new alliance as a complement to NATO. NATO was created in 1949. Now in September 1954 at Manila, they create a Pacific Alliance composed of the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, France, Britain, and Thailand, and the United States. Those countries joined the Sept Alliance. I might note, this is 1954. The next year, under the auspices of the British, a third alliance to contain communism, the CENTO Alliance, including Pakistan and Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Britain, these three great alliances ring the Soviet Union and Communist China. So this is a systematic global alliance. So we're focusing on Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was named, included at Manila. So the Geneva Accords separate North and South Vietnam, enabling the Americans to set up a South Vietnamese state. And secondly, you have this the creation of the Sept alliance, um, obviously directed against the containment, above all, of communist China. Now, I just wanted to ask you a question. Recently, similar initiatives have been taken by the United States. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? The United States has just recently, this last week's, has attempted to do much the same thing. What's going on? Does anybody know? You following this? It's quite important. Well, they're trying to set up in the Pacific, the CIATOS basically was dissolved and subsequent after the Cold War ended. So they're trying to set up a new CIATO with Britain, the United States, Australia. The New Zealanders have rejected the idea. The Philippines, Japan, and India. A great new alliance. It's in several parts, but nevertheless, that's the intent. And the idea is once again to try and create a means of containing China by essentially a military political alliance. But I would say that compared to Seattle, where the Americans were able to sort of, their allies were compliant, it's becoming increasingly clear that the Americans are having difficulty sort of organizing the Pacific in a new alliance against China. I would note even it's interesting that Canada has so far not signed on at all. But other countries are dragging their heels. The Indians and the Japanese, for example. And then it's interesting, the New Zealanders. And we won't even mention France. France, which was was a participant in Seattle. The French are outraged at the Americans. And so there are repercussions. But in any case, what I'm pointing to is the consistency of American policy. Faced with a strong China, the Americans are resisting by trying to get the rest of the Pacific and South Asia organized in some mode of containing China. Now, looking back at the specific terms of the Seattle Pact, I mentioned the terms of the Geneva Accords. Basically, it's a defense treaty, it says, but all of these powers say that if they're attacked, they will all come together and there will be mutual defense of one another. And the possibility of attack, of course, comes from China. But a protocol of the treaty further stipulates that in addition to the defense of each one of these states, that collective defense will be extended to Cambodia, Laos, and the free territories under the jurisdiction of the state of Vietnam. That means they include if somebody makes a move against Cambodia and Laos, the communists, but also Vietnam, the part of Vietnam controlled by the Bao Dai government, the CIATO will come to the defense of this government. And this is important because these provisions became the legal basis for the American full-scale invasion of Vietnam in 1965. They invoked the Seattle Treaty as a justification for what they were doing. Are there any questions about what I said? So the Geneva Accords are important. And the conclusion of the Seattle Pact is also important in this sort of restructuring.
Could
Anybody?
you, yeah, could you, so what was that about Cambodia and Laos? If they were attacked, they were supported by the communists, right? So
Yes.
what was the reasoning for the US full invasion again? Sorry.
So I'm saying that if they could show that, and it was not specified, if sort of external aggressors were to threaten any one of these three states, that is to say, Bao Dai's government, Laos or Cambodia, the Seattle allies, led by the United States, would intervene. This was now a difficulty with this, of course, is that the reality is that in all three of these states, eventually, by the time by the time you're in the mid-60s, there are communist insurgencies. The people who are rebelling are essentially communists who are Cambodians, or communists who are Laotians, or communists who are Vietnamese. So the idea of sort of external aggression, it becomes difficult to sort of parse that. And it's important because when eventually opposition to American involvement in Vietnam develops in the United States, the opposition begins to say, hey, there is war going on in these countries, but these are civil wars. They're wars, they're internal wars. Who are the external aggressors? We don't see the Chinese here. We don't see the Russians here. And even, of course, they point back to the fact that the North Vietnamese are coming down, crossing the 17th parallel. The administration, the American administration says, well, they're foreign invaders. And the opposition says, wait a minute, there was supposed to be elections. This is one country. What are you talking about? So this becomes a matter of disagreement, which in terms of the internal opposition to the development of the anti-war movement, which ultimately wins over a majority within the United States. The justifications for American involvement seem to be weaker and weaker in the eyes of even American citizens. That's the point I'm trying to make. Now, I want to now talk about the attempt to organize a South Vietnamese state. This is what we're going to be discussing at this point. So we basically have concluded the discussion of the French War. The French War starts in 46, it ends in 54. And now what we're looking at between 1954 and 1963 is what we call the period of Diem, because the person who Bao Dai is a figurehead. The person who emerges as the strong man in South Vietnam, who the Americans put into power in 1954. He lasts between 1954 and 63. And this is the period known as the Diem period in South Vietnam, the period of Diem. We're seeing a huge experiment on the part of the Americans to actually create a South Vietnamese state to block the Democratic Republic of Vietnam from taking over the whole country. This is basically what's going on. So in the first place, we can say that the first thing that happens is that the French leave. The French, they essentially leave Vietnam, but by the terms of the Geneva Accords, there was also to be a separation of the belligerents, North and South. And so what we find is that the Viet Minh who are operating in South Vietnam, well, about 150,000 of them, they moved north. About 150,000 Viet Minh troops crossed the 17th parallel, where the Democratic Republic of Vietnam is fully established. Of course, this was a deception because hundreds of thousands of Viet Minh remained in South Vietnam, and what they did was basically bury their arms under the ground. And they went into hiding. Essentially, they merged with the rest of the population. So yes, about 150,000 Viet Minh troops leave, but the rest remain secretly in South Vietnam. At the same time, with the help of the Americans, a huge evacuation of non-communists occur from the North. The North is now under the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So anywhere between 800,000 and 900,000 Vietnamese basically evacuate to South Vietnam with the help of the US Navy. There's a massive exodus from North Vietnam. Now, the man who organized this exodus was an American CIA agent, Edward Lansdale. Edward Lansdale. He had previously been the key American operative in suppressing the communists in the Philippines. He was now sent to supervise the establishment of the Diem government. And the first thing he did was to organize this massive exodus from North Vietnam. And this guy had been previously an advertising agent, and he organizes a huge movement. Who were these people that were leaving? They were all Catholics. They were all Catholics. And as I explained to you, the Catholics were close to the French. And many of the troops that fought under the French were, in fact, Vietnamese Catholics. Many of the administrators at the lowest levels of the French administration were Vietnamese Catholics. And so it was. Now, I want to make this point, that only half of the Catholics left. The other Catholics chose to remain in North Vietnam. These were Catholics who had nothing to do with the French. And so they remained where their homes were. But the ones who had compromised, who knew that they would suffer under the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, they left. But Lansdale made a big thing of all of this. They had American media there, and basically they advertised this both in South Vietnam, but also worldwide and in the United States as a massive flight from communism. They said, these are some of the slogans: Christ has gone to the South. The Virgin Mary has departed from the North. And the result was, this was a kind of propaganda thing, but it succeeded. It succeeded both, it had a certain influence, both in South Vietnam and in the United States, and helping to solidify the Diem regime. And the Americans resettled most of these people in villages in and around the city of Saigon. I'm coming to an end. Which was the capital of South Vietnam, in about 200 villages. And they made these Catholic villages in and around Saigon as strong points against possible later communist uprisings. So the Catholics, and I want to say not all the Catholics, but those who were anti-communist play a big role in helping the Diem government. They are one of the pillars of the Diem government, the Catholic population in South Vietnam. In addition, I would say, of course, now the landlords, the middle class, and some peasants were the supporters of the Diem regime. I would say the truth is that about 1/3 of the peasantry, this is a very important point, were supporters of Diem. 1/3 of them were communists, and 1/3 were neutral. As best as we can estimate, the peasant population, which of course are the majority, were divided in thirds: neutral, communist, and anti-communist. And overall, and to conclude, some peasants, the landlords, the middle class, the Catholic population, and of course, the old bureaucracy and army were the supporters of the Diem regime, as we'll see in the next class.
Can I, excuse me, Professor, can I speak to you really quickly at the end?
Yes, of course. Yes, I'm finished. So speak to me.
Okay,
Who is,
think
who am
you-
I, to whom am I speaking?
this is Dustin Young. I
yes.
believe you sent an email to me.
I did, because I got something from the disability office about you.
Right. So you asked me how can I facilitate your work on upcoming assignments? So are these assignments,
No, I'm talking about the class assignments. They said that you needed special provision. So what do you need?
right, so for the upcoming assignments, they are, we have to read books, right? And I'm assuming we're writing essays on them, I'm assuming?
Yes, the first assignment, it doesn't involve reading a book. It's about, I asked about whether the French were bringing civilization to the South, to Vietnam. That's the first question.
Right, when is that due?
It's on the 2nd of October. No, it starts on the 2nd of October. I'm gonna
Oh,
give-
okay, thank. Okay, okay. So,
Then there's a term test on the 15th.
oh, okay. But generally, so I have trouble reading in
Reading?
general. Yeah. So I have trouble reading because I have dyslexia. So
Sure.
so essentially, I guess for this, it would just greatly help me if there was extended time. Essentially, that would help me with the
Take
reading.
all the time you want.
That is essentially what would help me. Besides that, I don't think there's any way else to help me. That would just be the main way, and I'd greatly
Okay.
appreciate it.
Yes, you have, and we can sort of extend the time into the Christmas period, whatever you need.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it.
Whatever we can do.
Thank you
Okay?
very much.
Okay.
I'll be in contact with you if I
Sure. If there's
if
any
I-
difficulty, just email me, okay?
for
Or we
sure.
can
Thank you very
talk,
much.
okay?
Yeah, besides that, oh yeah, there's also during the test. I have 1.5. 1.5 for my accommodations for the exams and quizzes. I don't know if we have quizzes, but I know we have exams, obviously.
What is
Um,
that?
We have exams, right? Do we have a final exam?
We have, yeah, we have a term test and we have a final
Yeah.
based
So
on
for
these review questions.
so for those,
And I believe they're made them take homes.
okay. Oh, they're take homes? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I don't know how that's gonna work, but there's usually like a time limit, right? There's usually like, I don't know, like 2 hours for an exam or 1
Well,
hour
there's
for an
no-
exam.
We could.
Right, but yeah,
there's no
that's what I'm
time
saying.
limit. There's no time limit.
There's no time limit,
No,
so you can
because
hand
it's a
in.
take home. It's a take home.
Right, okay.
So, no, it's, you have all the time in the world.
Okay, that's fine then. Great, thank
Okay?
you. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Take care.
You too, thank you.
Bye.